Hey guys, so I promised a brief lecture video over ethics, and so here it is. Remember that you can find the documents that I'm kind of going off of and that will help you for the ethics exam in the course content section of your Blackboard section. Now, also, last thing, the exam for the ethics exam, it's only 10 items, it will be due next week. You don't need a proctor for it. There's no password. You'll just see the link, click on it. Now, once you click on it, you do have to finish it. But you'll be able to click on it, do it wherever. But be sure to go over these materials before you do. Okay, so there's a presentation and there's a handout that kind of goes into, well, it is the ethical code. Okay. So first, again, what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to kind of go over everything broadly, highlight a couple things, give some examples, in hopes that kind of makes things a little bit more salient for you. So first, we'll talk about the general principles for ethical guidelines. Okay. So principle A is the principle of beneficence and non-malfeasance. Basically, this principle dictates that we strive to help others and we do our best to prevent any potential harm that our work with them could cause. All right. Now that plays a lot into some of the research standards that we're going to talk about a little bit later. But for example, sometimes certain research designs, certain research questions require us to deceive our participants. But again, because we're trying to be benevolent. We have to take extra precautions and perform extra measures so as to ensure that we don't cause any harm. Okay. Fidelity and responsibility. That's the second principle. That has to do with basically us being open. So we can't do our work in our little cubicles and basically shut ourselves off to the rest of the world. For us that have published in research, if somebody requests our data, we have responsibility to give them our data. So also goes in that we have a responsibility to be to not mislead the field. Okay, and in fact, there have been certain scientists who have done this. Unfortunately, not many. I mean, it's very rare. And when it happens, these people lose their careers. So there's a general conception in the lay population that scientists are always misleading people. But the truth of it is that if it's found out that we're doing that, the scientific community is pretty cold about that. We're not okay with it. So when we scientists find out another scientist has fudged data or deceived us, or they're not engaging in good scientific practices, they get booted from the scientific field. So that one ends up being one of our, culturally speaking, the culture of science tends to be one of the more pressing principles that we follow. Next to that is the integrity principle. We want to be accurate. Okay, so a lot of times, especially if you go into science further on, you'll see that there's this, for many scientists, there's this emphasis that we do our best not to let our personal values cloud what the evidence is telling us. So we do our best to step away from our values and focus solely on what the data is telling us. Focus solely on what the theory and the evidence for the theory is telling us. So we try to be completely objective. So that's how we try to pursue that integrity. The next principle is justice. So basically, we just try to be fair to everyone. All right, and so that starts playing into things like in the research that we'll talk later on, with regards to. So if you have what's called a captured sample. So, for example, in most universities and psychology departments, students in the general psych courses are required to participate in research, or at least have some exposure to research experience. That makes them a captured sample or a captured audience. But that can be unfair if you require everybody to do research, but then the only way that they can get the points to satisfy this requirement is to do research, then it can be unfair, because especially in where some of the studies are in person, then not everybody's going to have as free of a schedule to do those in-person studies. If they're online, not everybody's going to have adequate computing devices. I mean, these days, I guess most people probably would, but still, there's the possibility that some people wouldn't. So there has to be alternatives for them. Also, if we don't provide alternatives for them, in the interest of being fair, in the interest of being just, then we end up getting we're coercing them to participate in our studies, which again is unfair. So that is it's unjust. So it's one of the principles that guides many of our practices. And then finally, respect for people's rights and dignity. This comes in terms of, sometimes we ask questions that people would prefer others not know the answer to. So, in the interest of respecting their privacy, respecting their dignity, we typically do our best to make sure that no one who doesn't need the data for the purposes of the study will see it. So, for example, in none of my studies do I collect identifying information. Not a single one. I don't ask who's giving me their answers, in the hopes that they'll be more honest with me, but also to protect their privacy, to protect their confidentiality. All right. So, if somebody tells me that they are part of some group that members of the group as a whole, the culture that they live in, may not approve of, well, they can tell me that, and because I haven't asked who they are, I couldn't tell who belongs to this unliked group. So, for example, in the South, I guess really in America as a whole, but certainly in the South, there's this strong negative bias against people who identify as homosexual. Well, if I ask a question about a person's sexual orientation, and they give it to me honestly, if let's say the KKK or some other hate group were to come by and try to coerce that information out of me to try and identify who is homosexual, it wouldn't matter, because I don't have that information to give, all right, because I haven't collected it. So we take certain measures when doing our research to protect the confidentiality and private information of our participants. Now, I don't collect any identifying information, but other researchers may collect identifying information, especially if they were doing something like if they had some reason to track them. Now, usually they won't use identifying information. What they'll do is they'll just give them a tracking number. So, you start a study, and you're going to have to come back multiple times in the future. Well, that first time, you're going to get a number, all right? And they track your number. Your number becomes your identity, not your real identity. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, let me know. So now we're going to talk about some of the standards. Okay. So first, let's talk about the standard of competence. Now this certainly plays into, well, it plays into all aspects of, you know, the psychological professions, but really in the clinical settings. Basically, a person needs to know their limitations, know their weak spots, and account for them appropriately. So, you know, if I'm a therapist, which I'm not, and I have some difficulty, and I have a client who has a similar difficulty, I know that I should be aware of that and probably take measures to prevent my own issues from affecting my treatment of the client. All right. The third standard, human relations. This is kind of a general standard that applies in a lot of domains. So for, you know, no unfair discrimination. You know, I'm not going to, I may in my research look for a particular sample, but I'm not going to discriminate for an unfound reason. If I'm going to do it for, you know, greater statistical control or greater experimental control, that's one thing. But I'm not going to try and I'm not going to look for information that would be discriminating. All right. There may be information that is that does disambiguate between groups. So, you know, there are certain findings that show certain groups have certain differences. So, for example, on average, men have larger brains than women. Does that mean that women are less intelligent? No. By no means does it mean that. But certain people who maybe don't look very deeply into what I said, they may take that as being discriminating. So I have to be extra careful to specify, you know, here's the difference and here's why the difference is. You know, so I have to take special care not to discriminate on the basis of sex, on the basis of age, on the basis of religion. Now in my research, you know, those variables may have important consequences for the variables I'm looking at. But I'm not discriminating so much as I'm controlling for certain demographic variables. Okay. You know, there are some general things like no sexual harassment. All right. No harassment, really, for any reason, not just sexual, unwelcome sexual advances, but really harassment for any reason. Back to that avoiding harm that we talked about before, you know, we take, both researchers and therapists take reasonable measures to avoid inflicting any kind of harm, you know. So, for example, sometimes we do pain research. In fact, there's a whole subfield of psychology just on pain. So they have to inflict a certain measure of pain, but they take extra precautions to make sure that that pain isn't undue. Okay, or actually that's not right. They may take extra precautions to ensure that that pain isn't excessive. Okay, or beyond the need defined by the study. All right, we're not gonna inflict pain on someone just for the hell of it. Okay, we don't want to do that. And in other domains, that's true as well. We don't want to inflict harm on someone for no good reason. Sometimes we do, like I said, in pain research, you know, other kinds of things. We may inflict stressful situations, slightly painful situations, but we're going to make it manageable. We're gonna keep it. It's not going to be extreme. All right, we have to keep it manageable because we're trying to avoid harm. There's quite a bit about potential relationship complications. Now, a lot of this is principally relevant to therapists. You know, therapists, they can't engage in intimate relationships with their clients. They can't engage in intimate relationships with the families of their clients. They can't engage in intimate relationships with former clients. You know, it's kind of, it's a similar thing even with being a professor. You know, you're not supposed to engage in intimate relationships with your students. You're not supposed to engage, and when I say intimate, I'm talking sexual. And some professors even go so far as to abstain from even friendship while they are their students. So that's what a number of the next few in that handout, if you're following along, are about. And again, you need to read those. You know, there's certain, basically, so there's certain guidelines dictating how professionals share information. And essentially, the gist of it all, and again, I want you to read them, the gist of it all is that you're not supposed to share information that there's no reason to share. Okay? And when you do share it, you're supposed to only share the part that's relevant to what that's pertinent. So also part of this kind of human relations comes the requirement for informed consent. So informed consent is one of the bigger kind of mandates, ethical mandates in psychology. Not only for research, which we'll talk more about that in a little bit, but also in therapy. You know, so there has to be an patients have to sign some kind of informed consent document saying that I understand that I'm entering I'm about to receive therapeutic services, you know, and that there are certain legal obligations on the part of the therapist. Okay. Now, privacy and confidentiality. I kind of already talked about that. You know, so we do our best to minimize any kind of privacy breach. Like I said, I don't even collect identifying information. Sometimes you have to collect identifying information. So, for example, certain studies require you to record the data, record a person, either their likeness or what they're saying, you know, things like that. In which case, people have to take extra precautions to ensure the confidentiality of that information. Again, you know, there's this push, there's this extreme. There's an extreme attempt to make sure that the people we work with's confidentiality is not violated. Now, standards for research. Okay, so if a person is going to be doing research with animals, and certainly with humans, then their research has to be approved by an institutional review board. So they have to submit their study, and the institutional review board will review it. If they say that, you know what, this meets a certain number of criterion that we have set for all studies, and so you can do it, then you can run the study. But if you haven't got institutional approval, then you can't do your study. All right. Now, there are certain kinds of studies that don't necessarily require institutional approval. For example, if you're not going to try and publish it, you probably don't need institutional approval. You probably should still try to get it, because people can do things that are potentially harmful. And they say, well, you know, I'm not reporting it, it's just for my own good. You still need institutional approval. You probably still need people to go over that, all right, just to make sure that you're not inflicting undue harm or unjust harm. Now, all studies require informed consent. So participants have to have an idea of what they're doing going into a study. All right, so an informed consent, and if you've done the studies yet, you'll note that there's a whole document kind of describing, giving you details about what it is you're going to be doing. All right, and there's some detail usually about why you're doing it. Now, that being said, sometimes knowing what is being looked for can affect how people react. And for that reason, many times people will they will engage in deceptive practices. They'll engage in deception. And they do that in one of two ways, either through omission or commission. Now, commission requires an extra degree of rationale. So if you're going to engage in commission, so you're going to actively lie to them, you're going to try and mislead your participant. And social psychologists do this quite frequently because social psychologists examine the effect of a situation on behavior. Well, in order to manipulate the situation, you have to make the participant believe in the situation. So sometimes they will directly lie to their participants. But when they do that, they have to do certain things. First of all, they have to justify the lie. All right? Why is it that you're lying to your participant? Why is it that you're not really giving them? Why is it that you're not allowing them to be informed and provide consent ahead of time? Well, so what do you have to do? You have to make sure that the study is justified. All right, the information that we would glean from this study warrants this momentary breach in consent. Okay. Second, there has to be no alternative. If there's another way that you can do this without lying to your participant, then don't do it the way that requires you to lie to your participant. But if there's not, and really this is the only way that this can be done, then that is added to one of the reasons why it would be permittable. Okay. So you really have to justify it. And then, once you justify it, and this is one of the other ones under debriefing, once you've justified it and it's been approved by your institutional review board, after they're done, you have to reveal what it is you were looking for. You have to tell the truth. All right, and then you have to give the participant an opportunity to take their data back. All right, because now they're informed. If they don't like what they've done, and they're afraid, or maybe even if they're just insulted about being misled. All right, it doesn't matter why, but you have to give them the opportunity to take their data back. And if they decide to take their data back after you've debriefed them and you've told them what you were looking for and what you were doing and why you lied to them, if they decide to say, no, you can't have my data, you have to delete their data. All right. So again, so yes, there are certain circumstances where we can deceive our participants, but never are there circumstances where we can forever deceive our participants. We have to take precautions to ensure that they know. Now, sometimes that's harder than other times. So, for example, if you're doing an online study and you try to debrief them, you give them writing, maybe you even post a video where you're reading the debriefing to them. Because they're online, they can close the browser, and so they may go on thinking something, and there's nothing we can do about it because they didn't stay through the whole debriefing. In those circumstances, we've done all we can do. But when it's an in-person study and they've been lied to, I know in my research, I always read the debriefing to them and then give them a copy of the debriefing. All right, so you really have to take extra careful. You have to be extra careful to kind of remedy any potential negative consequences of being deceived. Okay, so one of the parts of the research ethics is called offering inducements for research participation. One consideration that must be made is that the inducements have to be equal. So again, remember I mentioned earlier that if you require all participants and all students in a course to do some research, there are certain things that can make that more difficult for some than others. So you have to give them alternatives. Plus, some people may not like to participate in your studies, and so you have to give them an alternative. And so, for example, here at Cameron, and this is common practice for most places, we give you the alternative of reading articles and summarizing them for us. So you can do that if you don't want to participate in the research or can't participate in the research. All right, but you have to provide roughly equivalent, ideally exactly equivalent alternatives if you're going to offer inducements. All right. All right. So those were the highlights. Oh, there was one more that I really wanted to hit. You know, you probably heard about plagiarism. And, you know, I just want to reemphasize. You know, there are certain training modules. Please go take those training modules. Because plagiarism is kind of like academic infidelity. It's you know that it's like cheating on your boyfriend or girlfriend. All right, that's roughly equivalent to the emotional impactfulness of plagiarism. Okay, because basically you're taking somebody else's ideas as if they're yours. Now, that's how that just sounded. When I said that it's similar to cheating on a partner, I meant that the emotional impactfulness is similar, because I know when I see someone plagiarize, it hurts. It's really insulting. So plagiarism, you're probably going to hear it a lot in some of your classes about don't plagiarize, don't plagiarize, don't plagiarize. I mean, plagiarism is in my perspective, it's among the worst academic crimes you can commit, and you know the consequences of it are pretty steep. Especially like in one of my classes, if you do it once, you get a 0 on whatever it is you plagiarized on. You do it again, you fail the class. So it's a pretty egregious ethical violation. So, you know, because of that, we as professors emphasize it. We as professors go to great lengths to make sure that we're not plagiarizing. But it is among the APA ethical guidelines. All right, guys, that is all I had for the ethics guideline, the APA ethical guidelines lecture. I hope that this is helpful, and I hope that you all do well on that ethics quiz next week. If you have any questions, you be sure to send them my way. But that's all I've got. So have a great week.